Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Seth Monahan, I make music theory videos, and we're already up to number 23 in my series on classical harmony and counterpoint. This one's on a topic that doesn't get much direct attention from mainstream textbooks, but it's also one that's really important and potentially kind of confusing to students. It's called using figured bass to show non-chord tones. If you've been watching the whole series, you'll know that I haven't talked about non-chord tones very much since video 10, when I did my little show and tell of all the different types. I've been pretty consistently marking them in red in my musical examples, but that was mainly just to show you which notes I was leaving out of my harmonic analysis. But even despite the color coding, I'm just doing what analysts do most of the time, which is basically to ignore non-chord tones. But sometimes analysts do want to formally address non-chord tones in their analysis. And this is especially true when several non-chord tones happen at the same time. And the reason, I think, is the ironic fact that when you combine enough non-chord tones, they almost start to feel like a significant harmonic event, almost a kind of chord in and of themselves. I'll explain what I mean in a second, but first a quick heads up. This is a two-part video, and in the first section, I'll explain how and when we use figured bass to show non-chord tones. And then in the second part, we'll talk about a paradox that sometimes comes up, where a bunch of non-chord tones combine to make a thing that really looks like an actual chord, but isn't. And the thing is, you've got to watch both parts of the video because the second half leads directly into the next video, number 24, which finally addresses a thing called the cadential 6/4, which you have to know about. Okay, let's dive in with this idea that clusters of non-chord tones can almost feel like important harmonic events of their own. And to see what I mean, let's listen to the slow movement from Beethoven's first piano sonata. And I want you to specifically focus on the last bar, where three non-chord tones turn up on the same downbeat and then resolve at the same time into the notes of the tonic. Okay, let's zoom in on that last bar. Here's the score, and here's how it sounds again. And here is how we'd analyze it if we wanted to show that cluster of non-chord tones on that second downbeat. And the thing we need to talk about is this notation right here, because it tends to really confuse students. Because what we're seeing here is a combination of Roman numerals and figured bass that is different from anything we've seen so far. Until now, we've used figured bass mainly to show chord inversions. And because of this, you're used to seeing only a few different bass figures next to any given Roman numeral. For instance, next to Roman numeral 1, you're expecting to see maybe a 6 or a 6/4. These are familiar to us, right? Less familiar is that thing, because you and I both know that there's no such thing as a 1-9-7-4 chord. But here's the thing. In this kind of notation, the figured bass is not being used to show chord inversion. Instead, we're using it to show the movement of the upper voices. But to really grasp this, we have to think about figured bass in a new way. If you're like most students, you think of figured bass vertically. You look at this thing in the circle, and you see two stacks of three numbers, here and here, each of which tells you what we're going to see if we look above that stack. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's entirely fine. But in this case, because the bass doesn't move, you also have to think about these bass figures as three rows of two numbers each. In other words, you can't just look at the 9-7-4 stack on its own. You need to see that the 9 goes to an 8, that the 7 goes to another 8 and that the 4 goes to a 3, because each of those pairs represents a stepwise melodic motion over the stationary bass. So to be as specific as possible about this, the 9 over the bass note F represents the G, which is a ninth above the bass, the blue G, which moves to an octave above the bass on the next beat. Similarly, the 7 tells us the note a seventh above the bass, E natural, moves up to an octave above the bass on the next beat. And finally, the 4 corresponds to the B flat, the yellow note that's a fourth above the bass that moves to a third above the bass, the A natural. Now, I don't expect that this is going to be particularly hard to understand. The confusing thing is how the Roman numeral plays into all this, because for the first time here, we've got the Roman numeral and the figured bass telling us different things. The figured bass here tells us about the upper voice motion, as I just explained, right? We go from left to right, and it tells us the intervals of the moving voice. But the Roman numeral here tells us two things. Explicitly, it tells us the harmony we should understand to be active here, in this case, tonic. But implicitly, it also tells us which notes in the music are chord tones and which ones aren't. So in this case, the Roman numeral says, for the duration of this bass note, tonic is the active harmony. And thus, any notes that aren't in the tonic, any notes that aren't F, A, or C, are gonna be non-chord tones. So it's easy to tell that the first stack of numbers is just a big old pile of non-chord tones, since they correspond to G, E, and B flat, which are not in the tonic chord. And then that second stack is clearly all chord tones, since F and A are both notes in the tonic, in the one chord. So hopefully we can tell by ear as well. The downbeat chord is so dissonant, it's practically begging to resolve. It screams, I am a big old pile of non-chord tones, and it does that. Two more quick things. First, I want you to notice that these particular non-chord tones are all rearticulated suspensions from the previous 5-7 chord. The G, the E, and the B flat are all right there in register in the previous chord. The notation doesn't show this per se, but I want you to notice it because it's really common. A dominant that suspends over the bar line at an authentic cadence. The other important thing to understand here is just how common this situation is. Whenever you see this kind of notation with two sets of bass figures, the first one is almost always a pile of non-chord tones, and the second one almost always shows their resolution into chord tones. So what have we learned here? Figured bass can be used to show non-chord tones. When this happens, you'll have a stationary bass voice. The bass is just going to hold a single note while one or more upper voices move. And it's the job of the bass figures to track those upper voices, which will typically move by step. Though it's up to us to infer which notes are chordal and which ones aren't, using the Roman numeral as our guide. The Roman numeral tells us which notes are, in fact, the chord tones. So we could technically use this kind of notation anywhere. But there are two situations where analysts typically use it. The first one we've already seen, at cadences. Multiple non-chord tones are really common at cadences, both authentic cadences and half cadences. But analysts also tend to use this notation to show important suspensions. But before we look at suspensions, let's glance over one more embellished cadence. Here's the minuet from Beethoven's second piano sonata, and as you listen, keep your ears out for moving voices over stationary cadential bass notes. So this is obviously a parallel period in A major, and the PAC at the end is embellished exactly like the cadence we picked apart a minute ago. Non-chord tones, a ninth, seventh, and fourth above the bass, all resolve by step into chord tones. But there's another cadence 4 bars earlier, and that one's embellished too. So let's start with the chord of resolution. There are 2 E's, G sharp, and a B. So in A major, that's a 5 chord, making this a half cadence. And interval-wise, that's an octave, a fifth, and a compound third above the bass. So now let's analyze the downbeat chord from the top. A natural is a fourth above the bass and resolves downward into a G sharp. F sharp is a ninth above the bass and resolves downward into an E, and the tenor voice B is actually a chord tone that holds with the bass note a fifth above. So we show that with a 5 and then a line that goes straight under the second chord as well. So let's listen one more time, and as we do, I want you to really focus on the feeling of those accented clusters of non-chord tones, resolving and letting off tension as they do. Okay, so now let's use the same figured bass technology to analyze some suspensions. Somewhere along the line, analysts decided that it would be useful to classify suspensions using a pair of figured bass numbers separated by a dash. The first number is the interval of the suspended note above the bass. The second one is the interval of the resolution note above the same bass note. Let's see this in action with the slow movement of Beethoven's C minor violin sonata. We actually analyzed this one a few videos back, and when we did, I flagged two particularly beautiful suspensions, here and here, both over predominant chords. So let's listen for those right now. So the first suspension is a C over a B flat minor triad, the 2 chord. And as we might expect, it resolves downward by step into the chord root B flat. So to show that with the figured bass, we'd simply put a 9 under the C because it's a ninth above the bass, and then an 8 under the B flat for the resolution. And that's exactly how we'd classify this. It belongs to a family known as 9/8 suspensions. And while we were at it, we could also show that the octave above the bass, the B flat, falls by step to a chordal 7th, A flat, just before the chord change. Now, curiously, that A flat is itself suspended into the next chord, a root position dominant. And we could show that one with figured bass as well. In this case, we'd have a 4th and then a 3rd above the bass, making a 4/3 suspension. But that one seems more optional to me. It goes by quickly. Analysts don't use this notation to mark every single suspension, only the ones that seem especially prominent, like the one in bar 3. So Beethoven knows that you can't have too much of a good thing, so instead of one suspension here, he gives us 2 at the same time. Starting at the top, we've got a 9th above the bass that resolves to an octave D flat. That's another 9/8 suspension. Then beneath, there's a C natural, a 7th above the bass, which resolves by step into a 6th. So now that's a 7/6 suspension. And just to be thorough, we can show that tenor F natural in the left hand with a 3, that's a 3rd above the bass, which has that line extending underneath the notes of the next chord as well, just to make sure we understand that it's held the entire time. Let's listen to the whole phrase again. So with that, we end the first part of the video. Now it's time for part 2, where we address what I called a paradox. This situation where a bunch of non-chord tones moving over a pedal point combine to make a thing that looks for all the world like an actual chord. That hasn't happened in any of our examples so far. Our non-chord tones have always teamed up to make really crunchy, obviously dissonant sonorities like that one. But sometimes voices moving together over a pedal bass make a thing that sounds like a quote-unquote real chord, and we need to trust our ears and guts as to whether they should be treated like real chords or not. We see this in the very opening of the Beethoven Sonata that we used at the start of the video. Remember, it sounds like this. I want to talk just about that first full bar, and I want to start by doing a figured bass analysis, not Roman numerals, just the intervals above that stationary tonic bass note F. There are 5 different sonorities here: a 5-3, a 6-4, another 5-3, a 4-2, and an 8-3. And every single one of these corresponds to some triad or 7th chord we know. In simpler times, we could have just slapped a Roman numeral under every one of these. 5-3, obviously a root position triad, or in this case a 1 chord. Right? 6-4, that's a second inversion triad. So this would be B flat major or a 4-6-4 chord. There's another 1 chord. We move on to a 4-2 chord. That's a third inversion 7th chord, so it's an incomplete 2-4-2. And then we end with an incomplete tonic triad. There's no 5th, but that's totally fine. And we could even assign functions. The root position 1 chords are obviously tonics, and I guess the other chords would have a subdominant function. We've never seen 2-4-2 as a subdominant in major, but I'm working with what I've got here, okay? So all 5 sonorities can get their own Roman numerals. But do they deserve their own Roman numerals? Because now we have an alternate way of looking at it. What if those upper parts are just moving voices within a single chord over that stationary bass note? What if we just put 1 Roman numeral here, a 1, and then tracked all the other voices with figured bass and horizontal lines? In this interpretation, there's only one real harmony here, tonic, until the bass moves on the next downbeat. And any notes that aren't part of the tonic, I'm looking at U, B flat, D, and G, those are just non-chord tones. So I've just shown you 2 interpretations of the same passage, and I want to put them side by side so you really understand why they're different and what's at stake. Here's interpretation number 1, which puts 5 distinct chords in the first bar alone with no non-chord tones. And here's interpretation number 2, which hears only 1 chord in bar 1, but one that's decorated with moving lines that pass through 4 non-chord tones. Now, I should say up front, neither of these is like empirically right or wrong. It's a question of interpretation and how we hear. So I invite you to listen. How many chord changes do you hear or do you feel in that first bar? Listen again. Now, I don't know what you heard, but in my experience, trained musicians tend to prefer this second reading here by a wide margin. For many of us, the mood and pacing of the music just doesn't suggest rapid-fire chord changes. It's a slow, tranquil movement that suggests a measured, even harmonic rhythm, 1 chord per bass note. And now we've got the tools to show that very precisely using figured bass. So let's summarize everything so far and then look at one final important scenario. By this point, we know that we will sometimes find voices moving over a stationary bass. When this happens, there are usually non-chord tones involved, and we can always show these moving voices with figured bass. And sometimes several of these moving voices produce an apparent chord, but it's a matter of interpretation whether we assign it a Roman numeral. We have to ask ourselves, does it feel like the chords are really changing? Are the chords we see on the page really the chords we're hearing? So let's do one more example, and don't skip this. It's really important. Here is the slow movement from Mozart's K330 Piano Sonata. And as we listen, I want you to keep your ear out for situations where several voices move together over a stationary bass note. Here goes. Hopefully you heard two, here and here. Let's look closely at the first one. The bass line here goes from 1 to 5 to 6. And we know already what that probably implies, but let's go step by step. We do indeed have a tonic and a 5/7 over the bass notes 1 and 5. But then over scale degree 6, we've got a 6/4 sonority followed by a 5/3. And both of these could get Roman numerals. If we're feeling generous, we could call this two chords, a 2/6/4 and a root position 6. But does that make any sense functionally? 2/6/4 isn't in the big 18, and as a 2 chord, it definitely shouldn't come after 5/7. And then what's 6 doing there after 2, which it normally precedes? No, this is no good. But now we know there's an alternative. We can treat this as one chord, a 6 chord, with accented non-chord tones that happen to make a 6/4 sonority on that downbeat. The B flat is the non-chordal 6th above the bass, and the G natural is the non-chordal 4th above the bass. And they both resolve down by step to chord tones. Listen again and see if this feels right to you to have 3 chords here, not 4. 1, 5/7, and an embellished 6. So we are almost done here, but not yet, because we've just stumbled on one of the most confusing things in traditional harmonic analysis. If I've done my job right, you understand how and why I analyzed that second bar as I did. But it creates something that's visually confusing. Maybe you didn't notice it, but it is confusing. Look at this. Right there, it says 6/6/4. But there is no 6/6/4 chord here. 6 is D minor, and it is here, but it's in root position with embellishments that momentarily create a 6/4 sonority. Now, I've got the luxury of using color to show that. Making G and B flat red makes it very clear that they're not chord tones. But most music analysis happens in black and white, so if this were on paper, you'd need to rely on context to tell that the 6th and the 4th above the bass were non-chord tones. You'd need to know that this notation with the horizontal lines almost always shows non-chord tones resolving. So to wrap up, I'm going to give you a pro tip based on this very common situation, and this will be our springboard for the next video. Wherever and whenever you see a 6/4 moving to a 5/3 over a stationary bass, the 6/4 figures are showing non-chord tones, and consequently, they don't go with the Roman numeral. In these cases, 6/4 just isn't telling us something about chord inversion. It's not telling us to take some chord and put it in second inversion. So that's the end of this video. In the next one, we're going to use this same notation to show an embellishment of the dominant called the cadential 6/4. Don't miss it.